Good evening, my friend. Welcome once again to Hercule Mysteries, where shadows whisper beneath chandeliers and truth hides behind polite smiles. Tonight, our story takes us to the rolling countryside of Surrey, where an old estate stands among the willows. Windmere Hall. Its gardens are perfect, its servants discreet, and its secrets far from silent. It began, as these things often do, with letters, anonymous, cruel, and written in ink that smelled faintly of violets. They carried rumors through the hall like poisoned perfume. Within weeks, a woman was dead. And so, on a damp afternoon when the wind pressed grey rain against the windows, Hercule Poirot arrived at Windmere Hall, summoned not by the law, but by the fear that stalks behind it. This is the poisoned letters of Windmere Hall. Settle in, my friend. Let the fire burn low and listen as the rain begins to tell its tale. Chapter 1. The Letter in the Drawing Room. The rain had fallen without pause since morning, thin silver needles that blurred the hedgerows and turned the gravel drive to glass. Through that grey curtain rolled a small motor car, its lamps pale against the gloom, and within it sat Hercule Poirot, neat, compact, unruffled, like a gentleman carved from patience. When he stepped out beneath the portico of Windmere Hall, the butler was already waiting. Mr. Cobb, spare and expressionless, bowed with the solemn grace of a man who had been answering doors since the reign of another monarch. "Mr. Poirot, Mr. Hale is in the drawing room." The detective inclined his head. "You are most courteous, monsieur. I should hate to leave my footprints unannounced." Windmere Hall smelled of polish and old roses. Portraits glimmered along the staircase, proud faces, each gazing down with the slight impatience of the deceased. The drawing room was warm but uneasy. Conversation there moved like smoke that refused to rise. Benedict Hale, master of the house, stood by the fire with one hand upon the mantel. His sister, Mrs. Edith Locksley, sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, and near the window a young maid, Clara Finch, twisted a handkerchief between anxious fingers. "Mr. Poirot," said Hale, "forgive the melodrama. I would not trouble you if we did not already have a death on our conscience." Poirot's eyes travelled to the fire where a heap of grey ash lay faintly scented with burnt paper. "Ah," he said, "and the conscience, she burns as well?" Hale frowned. "The letters, anonymous, slanderous, I destroyed them." "That," Poirot murmured, "is what murderers hope you will do." Mrs. Locksley's voice was sharp. "You speak as if we have sheltered a criminal." "My dear madame," he said gently, "you have sheltered many things, wealth, habit, pride. Why not guilt as well?" It was Clara Finch who spoke next, her voice small but steady. "It began with gossip, sir. Notes left on trays in bedrooms, even in the nursery. Each one crueler than the last. Then came the one to Mrs. Denning, the housekeeper. It said she stole the silver spoons. The next morning, she was found dead. Poison, Hale said shortly. Cyanide. The police believe she took it herself." Poirot looked from one face to another. "And you?" "I believe," Hale said, "that whoever wrote those letters placed the bottle beside her bed." Poirot's moustache lifted. "Then, monsieur, we must listen not to the dead, but to the typewriter that spoke for her." He asked to see the library. Mr. Cobb led the way. As they went, the old house sighed in its joints. The chandeliers trembled as if remembering laughter long extinguished. Outside, the rain strengthened. Somewhere in the distance, a typewriter waited, cool, patient, ready for its next whisper. Chapter 2. The Library and the Lock. The library of Windmere Hall was a cathedral to comfort. Heavy curtains, green leather chairs, and rows of books that smelled faintly of dust and power. Upon a mahogany desk sat the machine itself, a black Remington with silver keys, its ribbon frayed and its platen ink-stained. Poirot bent over it as a priest might over a confessional. "Every writer leaves behind a vanity," he murmured, "even a liar." He pressed one key. It struck slightly crooked. The letter E printed darker than the rest, its tail smudged. "Observe, Inspector Vale," he said, for Vale had arrived from London an hour behind him. "Our author has a limp, but only in the alphabet." Vale examined the page Poirot had rolled in. "If the E leans, we can match it. You're certain the machine belongs to the house?" "Assuredly. Miss Finch tells me it lives here as a cat does, used by all, claimed by none." They tested another sheet. Again the E sank and the period struck faint. Poirot smiled faintly. "Every crime writes its signature before it signs its name." The library door creaked. A tall man entered, dark hair, travelling coat damp with rain. "Forgive me," he said. "I am Dr. Lennox Phelps, Mr. Hale's physician. I was called for Mrs. Denning's death." Poirot greeted him politely. "You suspected poison?" "Cyanide, no mistake, the smell alone." "Did you see the bottle?" "An unlabeled phial in her sewing box. Common potassium cyanide, enough to kill a regiment." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And you believe she kept it for her embroidery?" The doctor flushed. "I said nothing of belief, sir, only of fact." Poirot nodded. "And facts, doctor, are like servants. They obey the master who notices them." When Phelps had gone, Poirot turned to Vale. "He is nervous, not because he lies, but because he hides. There is a difference. The former fears discovery, the latter memory." Vale began to pace. "You think the letters were meant to drive someone to suicide? A game that went too far?" "Perhaps, but a poisoner who enjoys letters seldom stops at one death. They adore correspondence." Poirot's gaze travelled to the window, where the fog pressed close against the glass. "This house breeds loneliness, mon ami, and loneliness, she is a very obedient accomplice." A sudden knock startled them both. Mr. Cobb entered again, holding a silver tray. "This arrived by the afternoon post, sir." A single envelope lay upon it, the paper thick, the address typed, to Mr. Benedict Hale. Poirot took it carefully, slid a blade beneath the flap. Inside was one sentence, perfectly aligned. "The next will not sleep as easily as the first." Vale exhaled. "So the murderer writes again." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Non, mon ami, the murderer never stopped." Chapter 3. The butler and the garden evening spread through Windmere Hall like a slow tide. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains. The smell of damp wool and coal fire filled the air. In the servants' corridor, Poirot walked beside Mr. Cobb, whose composure seemed carved from old mahogany. "You served the late Mr. Hale as well?" Poirot asked. 32 years, sir. And the household runs now as before." "As near as may be. The young ones do not last. Too many stairs. Too little gratitude." They passed through a side door into the walled garden. The rain had stopped, leaving the paths dark and glistening. Somewhere a nightingale tested its voice. Poirot stooped to examine a patch of soil near the bench. "Your gardener is thorough. Even footprints are pruned." Cobb hesitated. "We keep order here, sir." "Order is admirable," Poirot said softly, "but sometimes it is a mask for panic." He straightened. "Tell me about Mrs. Denning." "She ruled the servants' wing," Cobb said. "Fair, not kind. She believed secrets were currency and spent freely. Yet she loved the hall in her way. I cannot think she would poison herself over a rumor. Then who would benefit from her disgrace? Cobb's answer came slowly. Perhaps no one, or perhaps everyone. A letter makes all men rich in suspicion. They re-entered the hall through the conservatory. The lamps in the drawing room had been dimmed. Only the fire burned. On the mantel lay another envelope, half hidden behind a vase of lilies. Poirot plucked it out. His eyes narrowed. The same ribbon, the same violet scent. He opened it, read, and folded it again. Addressed to Miss Clara Finch, he said quietly. It claims she is with child, by Mr. Hale. Vale's jaw tightened. A lie? Perhaps, but in a house like this, truth and gossip are twins who share a crib. They went to find the girl. She was in the scullery, her apron damp from washing, her face white as flour. When she saw the letter in Poirot's hand, she covered her mouth. I swear it isn't true, sir. I don't even… Poirot stopped her gently. Mademoiselle, lies need no defense. They die when ignored. But I fear this one was written to provoke another death. She looked at him helplessly. What do I do? You will do nothing. You will sleep in the west wing tonight with the door locked, and you will not drink tea offered by any hand but your own. He turned to Vale. We must watch the letters, not the victims. The writer feeds on reaction. Deny them their feast, and they will starve. Outside, thunder murmured far away. The night air had grown heavy again. Not with rain this time, but with something older, slower, waiting. Poirot glanced once at the darkened windows of the upper floor. Somewhere, he whispered, a typewriter dreams of morning. Chapter 4. The Housekeeper's Room. The west corridor of Windmere Hall held its breath. It was the servants' quarter, yet the hush there felt more like a chapel than a passage. Bare boards scrubbed to a pale shine, the faint scent of lye and lavender, a narrow runner that made the footfall of grief polite. Mr. Cobb produced a key. The door to Mrs. Denning's room opened with a tired sigh, as if the wood remembered everything and would rather not. The room was plain and quick to confess. A narrow bed made with hospital corners, a chest of drawers with polished brass pulls, a window that overlooked the walled garden and the orchard beyond. On the sill sat a small dish with 3 pins, a thimble, and a peony petal gone brown at the edge. Order everywhere, but order arranged by will, not by piece. Poirot did not touch the sewing box at once. He stood at the center of the room and let his eyes travel. The chair set square to the table. The ledger of household linens open to a page of perfect figures. The little calendar with its day torn neatly. Then he approached the sewing box, a stout thing of rosewood with a satin lining and a faint perfume that did not belong to Fred. He lifted the lid with 2 fingers. Within lay bobbins and needles, a packet of darning wool, a scrap of ribbon, and, cradled against the satin as if it had always belonged, the small brown phial the doctor had named. The glass showed no label. The cork waxed at the rim had been smoothed by a fastidious hand. On the satin beneath, a pale ring where the base had rested too long. Poirot bent closer. Do you smell it, Inspector? He said softly to Vale, who had joined him. Yes, the bitter almond, but beneath it, something else, a floral ghost. Violets, Vale said, surprised at himself. Exactement, not from the room, from the hands that placed the bottle here. He set the phial down and looked to the table. A blotter lay there, green felt, the paper insert stained with pale squares, where letters had been blotted before the ink set. Poirot lifted a sheet and, angling it to the light, found the faintest relief, the pressure of keys striking through thin paper. the E bit deeper and lower than the rest, a tiny bruise repeated several times. Carbon paper, Poirot murmured. Our letter writer keeps a copy, perhaps unthinking. Habit, perhaps the vanity of archivists. He slid the blotter paper carefully into his pocketbook. In the top drawer of the chest, under a folded apron, he found a handkerchief monogrammed not with D for Denning, but with E.L. Edith Locksley. The lavender sachet beneath it was crushed. The lace along the handkerchief's edge held a breath of that violet perfume again, stubborn as a memory. Poirot replaced everything exactly. He stood a moment at the window and watched the orchard. Rain had beaded the boughs like dull pearls. Mrs. Denning did not bring cyanide into her room for despair, he said. She brought it because someone ensured she would be seen with it after she was beyond speech. A tidy woman wishes to leave tidy answers. A cruel mind knows that. As they stepped back into the corridor, Poirot asked almost idly, Does Mrs. Locksley often visit the servants' rooms? Mr. Cobb frowned. She inspects, sir. She will not have standard slip. She gives handkerchiefs when she thinks a maid looks pale. It is her way of being kind. Ah, Poirot said gently. Kindness arranged like furniture. He closed the door and let the key turn softly, as one might turn the last page of a sad book. Chapter 5. The Nursery and the Note. The nursery looked out over the east lawns, a high room with pale walls and a frieze of painted swallows that had learned to fly in the wrong season. Toys were put away with military obedience. The rocking horse faced the window as if keeping watch. Miss Ives, the governess, met them at the threshold, mid-30s, careful dress, the particular calm of a person employed by other people's tempers. I have locked the night post flap, she reported at once. Since the letters began, I do not leave anything where a fearful child might find it. Très bien, Poirot said, approving. Fear enters by the smallest doors. On the table lay a child's envelope, unstamped, its flap unsealed. Miss Ives coloured. I was teaching a lesson in address. The little ones must know how to write to their father if they are taken to the seaside. She attempted a smile. Windmere manners do not suspend themselves merely because the weather is unkind. Poirot glanced at the tiny square of paper. It smelled faintly of nothing. Honest paper, clean as bread. He nodded and turned to the writing table where a second-hand toy typewriter sat, a relic of a Christmas when someone had believed imitation made learning pleasant. He pressed the key. It stuck. The letter E, fat and cheerful, sat straight as a soldier, not the limp E of the library's Remington. Bon, he said softly. The nursery plays at letters, it does not compose them. Miss Ives folded her hands. Mrs. Denning kept rules. She carried the household. I did not like her, but I relied upon her. The children did too. The house eats its servants and then complains of hunger. Vale's gaze softened. You have seen a long service. 3 years, she said, as if admitting to a theft. I came after my sister died. We were in service together once. She glanced away, letting the rest hover. The resignation, the grief, the refusal to elaborate. Poirot let silence rest a moment. Then he moved to the window. Along the lawn, a gardener pushed a roller. The path between nursery and library door shone from the day's use. On the bench below the window lay a book, left open and face down. He nodded toward it. One of yours? Miss Ives followed his gaze. Mrs. Locksley's. She sits there after luncheon. She reads improving novels half the time and improving herself the other half. Violets, Poirot said, as if to himself. I beg your pardon. The perfume, Poirot replied mildly. It stays with her book, even when she is gone. He thanked Miss Ives and stepped back into the corridor with Vale. You see the nest our letters chose? He said gently. A governess with no kin to defend her, a maid the house will not believe, a housekeeper feared more than loved. The poisoner's courage is always borrowed from the cowardice of others. They had not reached the stairs when Mr. Cobb found them again. Another letter, sir, for Miss Finch. His face was pale with controlled anger. It was found beneath the bell glass in the conservatory. Someone wanted it seen. Poirot took the envelope. The violet scent rose like a small, smug hand. He opened it and read without inflection, "Confess or be sent away by sundown." "The hour grows theatrical," he said. "Let us move quietly, Inspector, while the playwright grows bolder." Chapter 6. The Midnight Post. They decided to set a watch, not policemen in boots, but the kind of watch that houses do not notice. Poirot in the library chair beside the sleeping typewriter, Vale at the end of the long corridor where the west wing met the main hall. Mr. Cobb stationed at his own request by the conservatory door. Miss Finch made safe in a guest room with Clarice Hart's plain tea in her cup and the key turned. The night gathered itself and listened. Windmere Hall, in darkness, became itself, the tick of the regulator clock in the stair hall, the persuasive groan of an old beam making weather of its memories, the soft gasp of the ember in a fire that had almost but not quite forgotten how to burn. Rain returned in a fine veil that stitched itself across the panes. Just before midnight, Poirot heard it, a sound too small to be large, yet too intentional to be chance. Not the clack of the typewriter, that vanity had been given up for the evening. A whisper of paper and glass. He rose without hurry and crossed the library, opened the door to the conservatory, and stood among the ghostly shapes of ferns wearing moonlight. By the bell glass where Mr. Cobb had found the earlier letter, a hand withdrew. A gloved hand, pale, very fine. The figure behind it was slight and precise, wrapped in a dark shawl. Poirot did not speak. He simply stepped sideways so that the figure, turning, would see him not as a surprise, but as an option. "Madame," he said softly. The figure froze, then drew the shawl closer. "Mr. Poirot," said Edith Locksley. Her voice tried for hauteur and found only fatigue. "Insomnia," she added, as if offering a necessary vaccine. "The conservatory air is the only thing that soothes it." "Of course," Poirot said. His eyes dropped, not to her face, but to the hand. A glove of kid leather, the color of cream, the wrist trimmed with a narrow band of violet ribbon. When she saw his glance, she let the hand fall to her side. The glove brushed the bell glass and left, in the condensation, a crescent that was almost, but not quite, the shape of a fingertip. They stood a moment listening to the room breathe. "You mistrust my family," she said after a time. "I mistrust fear," Poirot replied. "In all its costumes." Her chin lifted. "Then mistrust the servants. They have not been raised to bear temptation. A letter is a shortcut to importance." "And to expulsion," Poirot said mildly, nodding toward the new envelope she had placed beneath the glass. He lifted the bell gently and took the letter out. The scent rose again, not overwhelming, not cheap, merely sure of itself. "You wear violets, madame." "It is an old habit," she said. "Our mother kept sachets in the linen press. I found one in the housekeeper's room yesterday and returned it to my drawer. If that is a crime, arrest me for nostalgia." "Nostalgia," Poirot said, smiling, "is never innocent, only endearing." He held the envelope a fraction too long, enough for the violet to insist upon its lineage. Then he returned it beneath the glass and stepped away. "Good night, madame." He did not follow her. He stood among the ferns and let the conservatory cool his thinking. When Mr. Cobb joined him 10 minutes later, Poirot only said, "Escort Mrs. Locksley to her rooms, if you please, and make certain the corridor lamps are relit. I do not like houses to dream with their eyes shut." At 12:30, Vale came down the corridor with a quiet fury he did not trouble to hide. She was placing the letters. "Yes," Poirot said, "but the author writes them in daylight when Fear has time to dress for dinner." "And you will let her?" "I will let her try to win," Poirot replied. "It is the final luxury of those who are about to lose." They went back to the library. The Remington sat in the lamplight like a complicit witness. Poirot rolled a fresh sheet into the carriage, pressed E with one finger, and watched the tail sink and smear. He smiled the small smile of a man who had seen enough. Tomorrow we ask the ink to sing. Chapter 7. The violets and the vellum. Morning came with a hard white sky and a wind that scolded the oaks. At 11, Poirot requested a small assembly in the morning room. Not a formal confrontation, merely the kind of conversation in which truth finds it less exhausting to cooperate. Benedict Hale, tight with sleepless dignity. Edith Locksley, immaculate, a violet at her collar. Dr. Phelps, scrubbed and severe. Miss Ives, neat as a new page. Mr. Cobb, upright as a yard rule. Clara Finch, pale but composed. On the table lay 3 things: the Remington from the library, the blotter page from Mrs. Denning's desk, and a single sheet of heavy vellum cut from Hale's personal stationery, the corner embossed with the faintest crest. Poirot addressed no one at first. He spoke to the room. "Anonymous letters are an old English game," he said softly. "They pretend to be democratic. In truth, they are aristocrats. They require leisure, privacy, and an audience. In a house such as this, only a few have all 3. He touched the Remington. "This machine prints an E that sinks and smears. So too did the letters we recovered and the impressions on the blotter in Mrs. Denning's room. The writer typed here, but she did not always type alone." A pause, a breath. Edith Locksley did not blink. Poirot lifted the vellum. "The paper used for several of the letters is of this quality, too fine for servants' purchases. Mr. Hale's crest is faint on some edges, pressed through by weight before the corner was cut away. The writer wanted cruelty, not clumsiness." Benedict Hale made a small wounded sound. "Edith." "Let him finish," she said, eyes on Poirot. "The scent," Poirot continued, "is the simplest aria. Violets." He bowed slightly toward Edith's collar. "It is not proof. It is a habit that travels. But here is proof." The wax upon the cyanide phial had been smoothed by a gloved finger. In the smoothing, it took up a trace of perfume. Not lavender from the linen press, but ionone, the modern violet a lady favors. On Mrs. Denning's satin, the ring where the bottle sat retained it. On the glove that brushed the conservatory bell, the crescent in condensation showed it again. Edith's stillness was precise. "All this to suggest that I perfume murder?" "No," Poirot said. "To suggest that the letters and the staging of Mrs. Denning's death were managed by a hand that must remain above suspicion, a hand that could move without being asked its purpose. Yours." Dr. Phelps stirred, relief and terror misfitting in the same face. "I believed the suicide because it was convenient to believe it," he said, as if to himself. "I am a coward." "You are human," Poirot replied. Then to Edith, "It began, perhaps, as discipline. Anonymous correction to shame a maid into neatness, to remind a butler that pride is observed, to punish a housekeeper who had become your rival in command. The game became a habit, the habit a power. Mrs. Denning would not bend. She threatened perhaps to expose some family economy you had managed without your brother's leave, the sale of heirlooms, the padding of accounts. You chose then to enlarge the game. Benedict Hale's face had gone grey. Edith? She looked at him without apology. The house must be kept. If you will not keep it, someone must. The letters to Clara Finch, Poirot said softly, were a stage. You wished her gone, perhaps because you feared your brother's sentiment, perhaps because she had seen you at the library too often. You wished to frighten her into dismissal. But with Mrs. Denning, you wished to do more. You wished to make a lesson. I wish to make an end, Edith said. Her voice was very calm. She had taken my authority, measure by measure, until the servants looked to her for permission to breathe. I warned her. She laughed. Men do not like women who set rules. Women do not like women who enforce them. So I wrote. And when she would not obey, I arranged. Silence followed, cool as a draught. The wind pressed a branch against the glass and let it go. Poirot's eyes were tender and implacable. You placed the bottle. You arranged the letters so that the police would call it despair. You placed last night's note beneath the bell glass so that the house would see what you wished it to see. But you made 3 mistakes. The first, perfume. The second, paper too proud for its disguise. The third, the Remington's E. It betrays its operator. On every line where you struck it, the tail sinks a little more, because you press with the index finger's tip, not the pad. A lady's manicure teaches a different pressure. He turned to Mr. Cobb. You will call the constable, if you please. Edith Locksley rose. She did not look at her brother. She looked at the window where the orchard had begun to flicker with a pale sun. You will be kind to the house when I am gone, she said, as if speaking to the weather. Discipline is only cruelty when it is badly performed. Poirot's voice, when it came, was as gentle as a hand closing a book. Discipline without mercy is not performed at all. It is inflicted. She offered her wrists to Mr. Cobb with the courtesy of a guest offering a teacup. He could not meet her eyes as he led her out. When the room had emptied, Benedict Hale sank into a chair and stared at the Remington as one might at a clock that had told the wrong time for years. I did not see, he whispered. No, Poirot said. You saw a house that ran. You did not ask upon what fuel. Miss Ives stood very straight, hands at her sides, as if taking a lesson. Clara Finch bit her lip and then let it go, unsure whether to be grateful for survival or ashamed that she had been chosen as bait. Dr. Phelps found a chair and sat down as if he had never learned how. Poirot folded the vellum and returned it to the table. We will speak softly to the law, he said. There was a game. There was vanity. There was the exhaustion of a woman watching everything she believes in untidy itself around her. But there was also a death, and the dead, they insist upon company, if not in the grave, then in our consciences. He picked up his hat. The day had brightened without becoming cheerful. Inspector, he said to Vale at the door, walk with me a little. The garden wishes to say something it forgot in the rain. They left the morning room as one leaves a theatre after the last curtain, quietly, aware that the play has not ended so much as settled into the memory where all true things are kept. Chapter 8. The Silence. After the storm. The afternoon sun fell gently across the lawns of Windmere Hall, but the house itself seemed dimmer for the truth it had heard. The windows were half open, letting in air that smelled faintly of wet earth and old roses, yet nothing inside stirred. Poirot and Inspector Vale walked through the orchard path, boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. The apple trees bowed under the weight of new blossoms. Bees moved lazily among them, unaware that murder had lived only a few yards away. "It is strange," Vale said, after a long silence. "A woman like Edith Locksley, disciplined, proud, even cold, and yet she descended to this." "Descended?" Poirot's moustache lifted slightly. "Non, mon ami," she climbed. "Murder, it is an act of control, of reclaiming authority when one's world feels disordered." She believed herself not wicked, but necessary. "Necessary," Poirot nodded. "Oui." Every poisoner begins with an argument, that the world must be corrected. The letters were not cruelty to her, they were instruction. But when correction did not suffice, she improved upon it with death. Vale kicked at a fallen apple. "She'll hang for it." Poirot stopped walking and looked toward the house. "Perhaps, but I think the court will see frailty, not evil, and that is what frightens me more." They reached the stone bench by the wall, where last night's rain still glistened. Poirot sat down, his gloved hands resting neatly on his cane. "Do you know what this house reminds me of, Inspector?" "No." "Of England herself, beautiful, proud, composed, and beneath that beauty, rot. Gossip, resentment, silence. It is not the grand passions that kill in such places. It is the small habits of cruelty." Vale watched the bees for a moment, then said quietly, "The maid, Clara, she's still frightened." "Then let her leave," Poirot replied gently. "Let her go to a life without silver trays or typewriters. She has learned what too many do not, that respect and safety are not always the same." He rose. "Come, mon ami, there is one more person we must see before we leave." Chapter 9. The Gardener's Secret. The gardener's cottage stood at the edge of the estate, half buried under ivy, its windows clouded with dust. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and damp earth. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove. Old Mr. Olcott, the gardener, turned as they entered. His hands were knotted and blackened with soil, but his eyes were quick and clear. "Morning, sir," he said, removing his cap. "You'll have heard the mistress is taken away." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, it is a sad business, and yet not without relief." Alcott nodded slowly. "The house has needed quiet for years." He poured water into 3 cups, each chipped but clean. "I saw her last night, walking the path after midnight. I thought it strange, her alone in the rain. She was talking to herself, or to the ghosts maybe. 'Order,' she kept saying. 'There must be order.'" Poirot accepted his tea. "And did you see anyone else?" "Aye," Alcott said after a pause. "Mr. Hale, watching from his window, like a man who's realized too late what his household costs him." Poirot sipped the tea. He loved his sister, more than he knew how to say. That's the trouble with these families, sir. They keep their love locked away till it turns into something else. "Regret," Poirot said softly. "Aye, and regret is a weed you can't pull." He looked around the small cottage, the orderly tools, the rows of pots, the care in every corner. "You keep your world tidy, Monsieur Alcott." The old man smiled faintly. "The soil doesn't answer back." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Perhaps that is why it grows." When they left, Vale said quietly, "Do you believe he knew more?" Poirot glanced back toward the cottage, where the smoke from the kettle curled like a sigh. "He knew enough," he said. "Enough to keep his peace. Wisdom and cowardice, Inspector. They wear the same coat, but one is lined with patience." They walked back toward the house. The light was changing again. that golden hour when truth softens into memory. Chapter 10. The final letter. The next morning, the servants gathered in the hall, subdued, uncertain, waiting for instruction that would not come. Mr. Hale stood by the staircase, his face drawn. On the table lay a single envelope, cream paper, unsealed. Poirot approached it slowly. His name was typed across the front. He opened it with a small blade. Inside, a single sheet, and upon it only one sentence. "Forgive me, I never meant to destroy the house, only to hold it together." The scent of violets drifted faintly from the paper. Poirot folded it and slipped it into his coat pocket. "She wrote this last night," he said quietly, "before she was taken." Mr. Hale's voice trembled. "She asked me to keep Windmere Hall as it was, but how can I? Every room feels guilty." Poirot looked around the great hall, the portraits, the stairs, the tall windows streaked with rainlight. "Houses are innocent, monsieur. It is people who fill them with memory. Change the rooms, repaint, open the windows, and you will have new ghosts, less cruel ones." He turned toward the door. The rain had stopped. A weak sun trembled over the drive. Clara Finch came forward, holding something in her hand. A tiny key, old and tarnished. "Mrs. Denning's sewing box," she said. "I think you should have it." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, mademoiselle, keep it. It will remind you that poison may hide in pretty boxes and gossip in polite voices. You will live wisely with such a lesson." She curtsied awkwardly and stepped back. Outside, the motor car waited. Poirot adjusted his hat and turned for one last look at the house. "Come, Inspector," he said softly. "Windmere Hall has spoken. Now it must rest." They drove down the long gravel path, through the iron gates, and out onto the quiet country road. Behind them, the house shrank into the mist, its windows glinting like tired eyes. Outro, the end of the letters. And so, my friend, another shadow fades from the English countryside. Windmere Hall stands silent again. But silence is not always peace. It carries with it the faint echo of a typewriter, the whisper of paper against glass, and the soft perfume of violets that will linger long after justice has gone its way. In the end, it was not hatred that poisoned Windmere Hall, but loneliness dressed as duty. The letters were written not to destroy, but to control. And control, as Poirot once said, is merely fear disguised in fine handwriting. So let the rain fall once more upon the gardens, washing away the ink of confession. Let the house sleep, let the truth rest. For somewhere, in another village, another house, another heart, another letter waits to be written. Good night, my friend. Until our next mystery, the end.